This is the antidote where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Jeremy, what you will get here with the antidote, what we try to provide is a perspective on the important topics of our time that you're not going to get very many other places. We do the best we can to address timely, important topics in as unique and I believe in as hard-hitting a manner as possible. What you will not get here at the antidote is what we were subjected to at the opening Olympic ceremonies in Korea this past week, where Mike Pence made a huge show of not doing the same thing that he criticizes NFL players for doing, and not respecting the customs and traditions of the country of Korea, whether you want to call it North Korea, South Korea, whatever. And so here at the Antidote, we are going to continue calling out pseudo-patriotism wherever we find it. And it's kind of funny how you get your Alex Jones types going on a soapbox about the media praising North Korea and condemning Mike Pence, which I don't think is true at all. And this big deal about Kim Jong-un's sister getting praise from the mainstream media. Number one, I highly doubt that's the case. And number two, I'd probably wager a guess that Mike Pence is probably a worse person than Kim Jong-un's sister is, considering his complicity in selling the Iraq war to the public as a member of Congress and sponsoring the Iraq war legislation, among other things that this rotten individual has done over the years.
In terms of caring about our own people and our own soldiers, Mike Pence definitely has a lot more blood on his hands than any North Korean, including Kim Jong-un's sister. Mike Pence, of course, not only did he vote for it, like a lot of clearly the majority of the Congress in order to pass the Iraq War initiative, but he was a major player in leading the way there. And the Iraq war has not only killed probably more than 1 million Iraqi people, but it's ended up in the death of thousands of American soldiers, over 100,000 if you consider all the suicides that have happened in the wake of these criminal wars of aggression all around the area. And Mike Pence is also a very suspicious character in relationship to the 9/11 events that included things such as the anthrax attacks. So people should go look back at all of that.
Very true, very true. But here in America, as long as you put on a MAGA hat and you express support for Trump, you're good to go regardless of your past or what kind of history you have or what kind of human being you are. So, I mean, that pretty much dictates the merits of who you are as a person anymore, is whether or not you're willing to don a MAGA hat and support Trump or not. So, anyhow, very important events over the weekend have broken out. It appears that there may be another escalation of hostilities right now between Israel and Syria and Iran, with Russia kind of playing a key role in what may or may not happen, and how much of what's going on right now with the shooting down of these was it a Syrian plane, I believe, or
it was the Israelis are saying that a drone, an Iranian maybe backed or created an Iranian manufactured drone controlled from Syrian land, made its way into Israeli airspace. The Syrians and Iranians appear to be disputing that, calling the Israelis liars about that being the case. And apparently the drone was shot down by an Israeli helicopter, and I don't know if it landed in Syria. I think that actually it landed in Syrian territory, but maybe it landed in Israeli territory. I think that those sort of facts on the ground need to be clarified right now. Yeah. But then apparently Israel alleges that it made a large response by sending, I believe, both an F-15 and an F-16 into Syria, and the Israelis claim to have attacked 12 different targets, including what they say were aspects of the control station around that Iranian drone. But apparently the Syrians, using, I believe, Russian technology, maybe supplied to them, I think, by the Iranians, anti-aircraft technology shot down, I believe, maybe both or at least one of the Israeli planes that then made its way back towards Israeli territory and then ended up crashing in Israeli territory. And I believe both of the pilots made their way out of the plane, and I'm not sure what the condition of them are. But it's ramping up. The tensions are ramping up. Russia is in the mix. Russia is giving warnings about an escalating process. The neocons are salivating in the United States, and it is a time of escalating tension. Meanwhile, this all happens domestically in Israel while there's an escalation of Israelis calling Netanyahu the crime minister. That sounds like straight out of like a Rastafarian book, the crime minister, Netanyahu, the crime minister. And then apparently there's also some murmurings that Israeli nuclear intelligence operative Arnon Milchan could also be potentially facing corruption charges. So we have a character, Netanyahu, who is coldly sociopathic, psychopathic on his best days, now potentially being under political threat after having been in power for many, many years, in the midst of apparently trying to escalate a military crisis in the region.
Yeah, one of the things I've always been concerned about, thanks for the breakdown, by the way, and whether or not this continues to escalate or whether it's how much of this is smoke and mirrors, how much of this is a genuine escalation, we don't know, but it's obviously very important to keep an eye on, and we will obviously be following the situation as it goes along here, but right now we just hope for the best and that nothing gets too far out of control, obviously. But with this, one of my thoughts about this whole Netanyahu Trump type of deal with both men being in all kinds of pressure from within as far as media goes, as far as powerful opponents within their respective establishments, to their policies and I think to their holding of office in general at this point. What will these two men do? What will a Netanyahu do? What would a Trump do if their backs really got against the wall and they had to do something to distract from a lot of the internal tensions going on? And right now, could this be Netanyahu's version of a wag the dog type scenario? We'll have to wait and see.
Yes, I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
Not that he's already not enough of a warmonger as it is, but in terms of starting, like perhaps trying to start an actual war type scenario with the neighbor.
Especially when Israel is in a much more vulnerable situation in terms of their actual citizens being potentially targeted by thousands of missiles, not only from Hezbollah to the north, but Iran and Syria. And so any logical leader who actually cared about their people, let's say in Israel, would not be escalating a situation where the Israeli citizens are actually under potential military threat. And it's clear that the Syrians are not going to be pushed around anymore in relationship to the years, basically, of incursions by Israel and others. But in terms of any air force, Israel's been sort of incurring across Syrian territory for a while now, and it looks like aspects of Syria, backed by aspects of Iran, are drawing a line in the sand.
Sure, indeed, and when I think that perhaps over the long run, the role of Russia might be the most important role of all, and it's not entirely clear exactly what Russia's motivations are, but at least according to narrative that's out there, Russia does appear to be attempting to try and maybe control both sides of this and to try to perhaps de-escalate tensions. And it'll be interesting to see where this goes with Russia, as we and others have identified Russia as a key player in all of this for many reasons, perhaps the key player in all of this escalating hostility. So we'll see where that plays out. Now,
and apparently as could be understood in relationship to the combination of Israel, the U.S., NATO's involvement in Syria, and clearly backing anti-Syrian government forces, including proxy relationships with ISIS, aspects of Al-Qaeda, that the Russian military has been on the ground in attempting to push back against what are seen and are literally terrorist forces, in having been invited by a sovereign government there. You can understand that even if there is some hanky-panky at the highest levels of relationship to Netanyahu and Putin, and whether there is some type of intelligence sharing operation, or as Top Yacht suggested, definitely a technology sharing operation in relationship to U.S. technology, U.S. intel filtered through Israel back to Russia. You could understand that the Russian troops have built up a resentment and an anger against the Israelis, amongst others. So so it's the situation involves a lot of different interests potentially.
Yes, indeed. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. And there was another story came out of Israel this past week that I found very interesting. I think it actually is probably from a couple of weekends ago, actually. I want to say about 8 or 9 days ago, and it's a story related to this efforts in Israel, which are very similar to efforts going on in Western countries right now, particularly in Europe, to do what Israel calls controlling, migration from African migration into Israel from African countries. And Netanyahu made a statement. I guess this would be to the equivalent of his cabinet, what the equivalent of a cabinet here in the United States would be, that George Soros is responsible and is behind efforts to stop Israel from controlling mass migration. And of course, you hear the same talking points in Israel that you hear in Western countries, that mass migration causes a rise in criminality and a rise in just joblessness and efforts to not contribute to society, combined with it destroys cohesion. And in Israel, you hear a lot of talk that it destroys the Jewish nature, or the Jewish Israeli nature of the state as far as the culture and the customs go, and all these typical talking points you hear in Western countries. But Netanyahu apparently made this statement that George Soros is directly responsible as far as funding organizations that are posing opposition to Israeli efforts to control mass migration into Israel from African nations. And I find this extremely interesting because I think this is the latest sign, I think, that there is a war going on between a lot of this, you might call it the Jewish left, this global, maybe the global left, the global liberal Zionist elements, and these hardline Zionists that are, of course, currently in power in Israel, that appears to have taken the reins of power in the U.S. in a lot of ways, with Trump and this shift towards a more hardline support of Likud policy when it comes especially to the settlements, when it comes to Jerusalem, when it comes to taking a hard line on the Palestinians, to the point of taking away any and all aid that Palestinians receive from the United States when it comes to these matters. And there were a couple examples of this in recent months. The first one was when Netanyahu visited Hungary, and Israel practically sided with the Hungarian government when it conducted an anti-George Soros campaign, which many left-wing Jewish groups called anti-Semitic. And then the next step, of course, was Netanyahu's own son, Yair Netanyahu, posting on his Facebook page a meme of George Soros as kind of a puppet master with his tentacles spread out, and as a puppet master of Ehud Barak and other Israeli establishment figures who are opposing Netanyahu, who are involved in this corruption probe against him. And of course, this got Netanyahu's son a lot of praise within the alt-right, even the openly anti-Jewish alt-right, such as the Daily Stormer, which proclaimed Yair Netanyahu is itself is the world's number one Yair Netanyahu fan site. And now this most recent escalation, I think, here with Netanyahu saying that Soros is directly to blame for the efforts to stop Israel from controlling migration from Africa. I think that this is a latest escalation and a sign that there is a major war going on maybe within this Jewish Zionist establishment. And also, I think it's another indicator of this common bond that kind of ties the right wing in Israel with the extreme right here in the West, as far as these policies of migration and culture go.
Yes, and these bookends, these sort of Zionist bookends in many ways, and a dialectic, a strategy of tension, and of course that's the way a battery is created, is by creating poles, and then the energy is created in the uh, mm, in the difference between the poles, and so you see and there's a lot to this because, of course, the United. We've talked about this before. The United States, our role in relationship to artificed and controlled immigration patterns was not so much based around aggressive warfare, but it was much more based around what's been termed globalist economics, neoliberal economics, the rise of NAFTA, the evisceration of the domestic Mexican economies, of the land-based farm economies, and the looting of Mexican lands, also the role of black ops, drug war, the training of certain sort of paramilitary groups throughout Central America, MS-13 actually arising in relationship to CIA black ops all throughout Central America, the training of paramilitary in relationship to another sort of dialectically constructed strategy of tension of the Cold War and the communist and the capitalist and these types of things. And then in the wake of NAFTA, the using of the what been made vulnerable populations in Mexico, especially in relationship to certain displaced urban and rural populations that then sought to go north looking for some way to support their family, which was then used as a shape charge against the American workers in terms of creating a permanent underclass that could be then used to drive down labor prices and these types of things. Now, in the wake of September 11th, and if we could actually think about if there is a singular leader of a state in the world who, at this point, who's still in office, still in power, who was central to the architecture of not only September 11th, but the more general so-called war on terror, you'd have to say it's Netanyahu in many ways. And so then in the wake of September 11th and the wake of massive aggressive warfare in the Middle East, in many ways directed at the enemies of Likud, and this relationship of Netanyahu with certain American Zionist neocons in relationship to the clean break doctrine is unavoidable and inescapable intellectually in relationship to the driving of these wars. Now you have destabilized populations, and not only from aggressive warfare, but in an intense primary way, you do see the creation of the new immigration patterns into Europe from aspects of the Middle East and Northern Africa, in very much directly related to these aggressive Zionist wars. And then, so, hearkening back to George Soros as of course, he's not the only player, but in many ways, he's the most obvious archetype of the sort of pseudo-progressive, but definitely
a boogeyman in a lot of ways to just pin any and all like evil on, as far as being like a, somebody who is just as the boogeyman to use as the person to try to stop any type of support of any kind of like actual left-wing progressive policy, period. Just tie it all to him, and therefore nothing good comes out of anything that's got his fingerprints on, even in the slightest way.
And in many ways, he really is the perfect archetype of globalist, neoliberal, Zionist politics. In many ways, both in terms of his background, his economics background, where he plays the role of the globalist in undermining currencies around, betting against nationalist currencies around the world in order to make himself money, and then the combination of that with believing that it's in his rights or in his interest to go around funding externally the politics of countries around the world. And at the same time, you have to throw in this idea that it was George Soros in the wake of September 11th here in the United States that I believe did fund a full-page ad of some, I believe, being against the Iraq War. So it's interesting. So there is a lot in the midst of this, and again, similarly to what someone like Churchill would propose, that me as a Jew, let's say, my choice is apparently between Bolshevism and Zionism. And once again, if my choice is between George Soros and Netanyahu, once again would have to choose neither nor. And I do think that the inescapable logic that is being clearly shown factually right now in relationship to the what's a lot of people have a hard time understanding of this hard right Zionist relationship with the hard right fascist, even sometimes Nazi elements. This goes way back to the beginning of Zionism. The Zionists were were realpolitik people. They believed in the idea of eugenics in relationship to internally to the Jewish people. The relationships of the German National Socialist regime and the Zionists is pretty darn well established. And who would be a better ally to people who are trying to do mass population transfer from the Caucasus Mountains and parts of Europe into the Middle East than someone who's going to drive the Jews out of Europe. So these dynamics are old, and in many ways, maybe we could actually begin to continue to see the evolution of this old school relationship into our current politics in the 21st century of the relationship to the alt-right, the Trump Zionist camp's relationship to the alt-right, and the rise again of racialist politics, the rise again of ethno-state credibility and these types of things. And of course, right in the mix there, once again, is people like Netanyahu.
Yes, and I think we're going to take some time to talk about this maybe on another show, maybe even on our next show. But a key player in this whole understanding this entire relationship between the alt-right and the just right-wing populists in the West in general, I kind of use the term populists in quotations, quote-unquote populists, and the Israeli hard right is one Stephen Miller. And it's very interesting because Stephen Miller comes from an openly Jewish background. He's actually very much cites David Horowitz as being a tremendous influence on him. David Horowitz stated of all the cabinet officials, all the people that Trump has, he's most proud of Stephen Miller because he kind of feels like Stephen Miller is like forget exactly what he said, something along the lines of being like a child to him or something, because Horowitz had a major role in Miller's evolution as an activist over the years. And Miller, of course, was friends with, or their relationship's not entirely made clear how close they were, but Miller and Richard Spencer had a friendly relationship back when they were college students with the college Republicans. I believe it was at Duke University. And now Miller has become, of course, with Steve Bannon gone, he's become the most outspoken voice, taking a hard line against immigration, against mass immigration, against any type of all the immigration-related rhetoric within the Trump White House. He's become sort of a hero to the alt-right. You even got Kevin McDonald's Occidental Observer website posting an article by a Jewish person saying that we need more Jews like Stephen Miller who are willing to basically take a stand for Western civilization and take a hardline stand and defend our countries against mass migration and immigration. So it's funny to see this ostensibly, which claims to be anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish power, alt-right, openly aligning themselves and proclaiming as a hero a man who is pretty much was trained and in a lot of ways groomed by David Horowitz, is one of the most frothing at the mouth, hardcore Zionist supporters of the state of Israel, supporters of military action against Iraq and Iran that you'll find walking the face of the earth. So I find that very interesting. I think it's important to understand in the context of this relationship.
Yes, and which which in my mind then I pops into this article that I think maybe Henry McCoe sent out in relationship to Chabad Rebbe Schneerson and his group being steered and protected on in some type of diplomatic fashion in relationship to Nazi Germany on their way somewhere. And so these dynamics are still so much in play, and the progressives pretend to not understand them. Especially the progressive Jews and progressive Zionists pretend to not understand, and they're just stunned to see this relationship between what they see as the sort of like hard right-wing Zionist and what they see as the Nazis. But this is a natural relationship that's ongoing.
It is. Absolutely. Yeah, it totally is. And we're going to continue to analyze this in the future. I think we're going to revisit this Stephen Miller topic in long form here in the near future. But right now I'd like to get into topic of what we talked about, and I'm going to let you take the reins on this here in a minute. 2018 is being the year of debate, and I'm going to kind of talk real quick about this. I'll let you take the reins. But I noticed last year that as soon as Trump took office, you saw this escalation of protests and attempts to shut down a lot of these admittedly provocative right-wing speakers, people such as Milo at Berkeley last year. And there was an event with the neocon thinker, I guess you'd call him, Charles Murray, who was one of the co-writers of the Bell Curve, which puts out the theory of racial differences in IQ, and this being a key proponent in race relations, and him being basically forced out of a university talk in Vermont. And then there's a controversy now. This is just another example, a controversy now over Steve Bannon being invited to speak at the University of Chicago by a professor, and now there's serious efforts going on to try and keep Bannon from speaking. And I noticed this last year with Richard Spencer at the University of Florida last October. I took time to listen to this hour-and-a-half speech he gave, and throughout the speech there were just people just trying to get a reaction out of Spencer, just riling him up, basically calling him a Nazi, calling him a fascist, saying he has no right to speak there, you don't need to be heard. And Spencer just spent the entire time just trolling this audience of people who were protesting him. I mean, it was a I gotta admit, as detestable as he is, it was a pretty masterful troll job on Spencer's behalf, and I don't think that this effort was productive on behalf of these people who were trying to shut down his speech. So I realized when I saw this that one of the things that stuck out to me about this Richard Spencer speech is that regardless, and let's not even take into consideration flaws or problems with Spencer's ideology and his proposed solutions, just the crux of what he's saying, you could make the argument there is a serious intellectual base to the things he's saying. He's laying out arguments in what you could call an intellectual manner. And Spencer, when you listen to him, he is not at all the stereotype that the media makes, that media may want people to believe a quote unquote white supremacist or neo-Nazi. He's anything but this backwards, whatever you want to call backwards thinking person. I mean, Spencer's clearly a very intelligent. He's very smart. He's well spoken, and he lays out his arguments with reason and what people could perceive as being logic. And I think this actually draws people to Richard Spencer, people like him. And I think that going out and trying to shut down his speech and just yelling and screaming and calling him a fascist and a Nazi, trying to keep him from speaking, I think that's counterproductive. And I'll give an example of this. Last year, I believe, it was last year before I left Kansas City, we went to the Kansas City Public Library, and Condoleezza Rice was speaking. Condoleezza Rice, one of the most notorious war criminals of our generation, obviously, with her role in the Iraq War. But Condoleezza Rice came to speak, and while we did confront her afterwards, we listened to her, and I think what we've come to realize with these type of people is that it's important to actually listen to them. It's important to hear what they have to say, because we can learn things from hearing them talk. Condoleezza Rice or Richard Spencer, whoever it is, they could drop some very useful nuggets when they're speaking. When they're speaking, they can say things that we could pick up on and learn from. We can maybe understand a little bit of their ideology, where they're coming from, why they think the way they do, what what is behind their line of thinking, what is behind their motivations. And so I think it's very important, rather than trying to shut people down, I think it's very important to listen to them. And don't get me wrong, the right wing, they do the same thing when it comes to anybody who criticizes Israel or who criticizes Zionism in particular. I mean, they do the same thing, but I think the real problem is there's a lot of unwillingness among the quote unquote left to have any sort of dialogue, intellectual dialogue, which is what is needed with the Richard Spencers of this world if you want to actually defeat their ideas and effectively counter their ideas, would be to actually have an intellectual based dialogue with them. And of course, there's a lot of areas where they need to be confronted that people are simply not willing to confront them on. But the key, I think, is intellectual debate. It's intellectual discourse. And the problem, unfortunately, is I'm seeing it primarily from the left nowadays, where, especially since Trump came into office, there is a very much an unwillingness to participate in any type of dialogue with anyone who they consider to be outside of their outside of what they perceive to be rational and normal lines of thinking. Like if you could be perceived as an extremist in the slightest bit, then you're not worth having dialogue with. You shouldn't be listened to. You should be shut down. We shouldn't try to learn anything from you. We shouldn't try to intellectually dialogue with you. And I see this as a major problem. And one thing that you've alerted me to is that there is this effort among various leaders within the alt-right to open up dialogue with people who they don't entirely agree with, who they disagree with. There was a debate between Richard Spencer and this black conservative lady who has a serious problem with the alt-right and some of its racial ideology, Tree of Logic. And so I think perhaps what we might be getting here, you've described this as perhaps a bit of an opening to actually start dialogue with these people. And you've coined 2018 as being the year of debate. Why do you believe that?
Yes, and there's a lot of complexity here. First of all, going to the root of what politics actually is. And although there are those who would like to say that politics is the art of compromise, and there's one aspect of that I do believe that that's partially true. But in reality, politics at its best is warfare. It's intellectual warfare at the highest levels in order to create possibilities for cooperation, because one has won the clash of ideas at the highest levels. And I've said before that in many ways, actual physical war, as far as I'm familiar with it in the last 100 years, has almost always been the failure of politics. It's been the failure of people to be involved in politics, of the average people to be engaged in politics in effective ways, and it's been the failure of the politicians to actually represent the people that voted for them. And in many ways, of course, to be the puppets of those who profit in all kinds of ways from physical war. That almost always it tends to hurt the people, we the people around the world on the ground primarily, and not the intellectual elite or the commanding political heights or the commanding financial heights. They seem to always evade the actual harm there. So what my sense is that it's time to escalate the clash of ideas. And it is clear that Richard Spencer, for example, is a masterful troll. He's a masterful troll. And he clearly presents himself and his ideas with a sheen of logic. But in many ways, I would say that the left who see him as a Nazi, let's say, and they would need to explain what that means, why that's a bad thing, why they disagree with it. So maybe dialogue is not really the proper word, but debate really is the proper word. And that unless you're committed to actual violent physical civil war, then you almost have to be committed to intense intellectual clash of ideas and debate. It's almost one or the other. And I understand this whole idea. People do not want to sort of give credence to those that they see as promoting ultimately genocide and these types of things. I understand that at some level. But really, a lot of that is also doesn't have tons of integrity behind it, too, because sort of hearkening back to this difference between Kim Jong-un's sister and Mike Pence, although there's so many people in our country who have been propagandized both across the political spectrum that would, if they had to choose between having a conversation with, being seen to have a conversation with Mike Pence and a conversation with Kim Jong-un's sister, they'd choose Mike Pence because he's the normalized element there. In a similar way, like the people from the aspects of the left would rather be seen debating or having a conversation with war criminals like Hillary Clinton or other Democrats that, or even progressives who are involved with, for example, the propaganda around the Syria destabilization, creation of a so-called civil war campaign, than they would with actually having a head-on debate with people like Richard Spencer. At the same time, I will have to admit that I see Richard Spencer as a masterful troll, but when it comes to actual political philosophy, I don't think there's much there. And so I am challenging the so-called alt-right to a real duel of ideas that has historical substance on the table. And my sense is that this is in many ways I would call them Jewish power tools. That's my sense of it. And someone like Andrew Anglin, Meyer Amschel Anglin, in many ways is a Jewish power tool. And I don't think it's quite just a coincidence that he published Jewish Zionist troll Joshua Goldberg for weeks on end. And whether it's because it's an operation at some level, or whether it's just because it betrays the vulnerability of his so-called philosophy to Zionist trolls, and this old relationship between the race obsessed, the ethno-state obsessed, in relationship to Jewish power. And I don't know, but I don't believe the ideas are actually there. I believe the evasion of people like Mike Enoch of the hard facts about September 11th and what the war of terror really is betray a certain, at the very least, a certain intellectual cowardice or a lack of real moral courage to deal with the realpolitik of our situation, where it's not just about cultural warfare and gossiping about the potential in 50 years or 100 years of an ethno-state and debating about how much potential state violence will be needed down the road. No, meanwhile, the state violence is very, very real and very in our face, and it's not just against Israel's Arab enemies. It's also here.
Sure, absolutely. I wanted to say with regards to Spencer that, I don't disagree with you. I don't, they're really, at the end of the day, Spencer's ideology really is just Zionist racial ideology, replacing Jews with white people, basically white Europeans, I think, in a lot of ways. But I do think that Spencer is able, at the very least, he does have what appears to be at least an actual, he's actually presenting what could be perceived by a lot of people as a, quote, solution, regardless of any type of flaws or problems associated with that solution. He is putting out something that could be perceived as a solution, and he's doing it in what can easily be passed as an intellectual or logic, reason-based manner. And what I think is that when you have these Antifa types just trying to shut down his free speech wherever he goes, trying to keep him from speaking, rather than actually corresponding with them in the free expression of ideas in an actual intellectual manner, I think that gives credence to Spencer in a lot of ways, and people like him, and it lures people to him, I think. And so, and at the very least, it even will lure people who aren't normally sympathetic to him that, wow, well, these people are really being irrational and unreasonable when they're just going out yelling and screaming things at him, rather than maybe listening to what he has to say and then challenging him intellectually. But you're right. about Enoch, for example, on September 11th in Deep Politics, and his stating on the record about his opinion on people who believe that Israel was involved in September 11th. And honestly, the area where people like Spencer and Enoch and David Duke and Andrew Anglin need to be confronted more than anywhere else, I think, is on issues of what you'd call deep state criminality, deep politics. And as long as the left, quote unquote, resistance is out just trying to shut these people down, calling them fascists, Nazis, trying to keep people from having any type of dialogue or correspondence or debate with them, and rather than just putting out these lines of what they are and that they're evil, they shouldn't be talked to like human beings, they shouldn't be addressed like everyone else is, they're beneath us. I think that keeps us from, number one, keeps us from having understanding of what the opposition, what these people believe, and it keeps us from actually challenging them in ways that can really, I think, put pop their bubble, so to speak, as far as their ideology and what makes them tick and how they are able to sustain so much momentum and grow and gain in popularity and awareness among people. And I think that this is more than just a constitutional matter of freedom of speech. I believe that debate and dialogue in this manner is crucial because it's important to understand what these people represent, because if you understand what an Andrew Anglin represents, if you understand what a Richard Spencer represents, if you understand what a David Duke represents, in the case of someone like David Duke, understanding his background, which we've talked about before, is very important. Understanding where he comes from and what he's saying and how it might benefit people in positions of power, benefit from his speech and from his rhetoric and from what he's putting out there. It's vitally important, not just for constitutional reasons of free speech and just the moral principle, the idea of free speech, but it's important to understand what these people represent, to understand what they believe, and then you can challenge them intellectually. And I believe that ultimately, effectively, is the way to kind of put a dent in their armor, so to speak, that allows them to continue to have the influence and the perpetual attention they receive. So I think that is where we need to go with it.
I think you're right in that the basis of potential political progress, let's call it, does have to do with an ability to not only understand what you think, but to understand what other people think. Even those people that you see as your political enemy or your nemesis, these types of things, if you're unwilling to really sort of consider exactly what they think or where they're coming from, that type of thing, then you're not really going to have an effective political response to them ultimately, other than potentially having to use some type of violence or force or state sponsorship of policy to shut them down. And this ultimately is where I really believe in what I see as the core of the American political system, which it's not a coincidence that the First Amendment is first. It protects all of our natural God-given rights that are so key, that are the most key politically. And I think there are, in certain ways, other more fundamental physical rights maybe that have to do with the protecting of our physical commons and our ability to provide for ourselves and our families and our nations and our peoples and these types of things. Politically, the fundamental tools that we have, the fundamental rights that we must have in order to produce a polity that represents ourselves, is freedom of speech, freedom of press. In many ways, you can sort of think about it. Freedom of speech is your freedom to say what you think. The freedom of press is actually the freedom to be able to hear what other people think in many ways. And then the freedom of assembly is the right to discuss it all together once we've had both of those things in play. And then, of course, you have freedom of religion, which in many ways, in a very deep fashion, has to do with freedom of conscience. Freedom of moral conscience, freedom of spiritual commitment. So even those who may believe that they're anti-religious or atheists, these types of things, I believe it's their religion, their right to not believe in God is protected under freedom of religion, of course, meaning you don't have to take an oath to be a political figure that's related to believing in God. Yes, there's some contention about, oaths and Bibles and God speech and stuff like that, but there is no real atheist test in a legal fashion in relationship to our political system. And then, of course, there's petition for redress of grievance, which means that it's we, the people, who ultimately hold the power in relationship to our government and government officials and these types of things. So this is the core. This is the core of our political system that I believe deeply in, and I'd say that it's the place that almost everybody who I believe has something to offer to our future together believes in too. And so that is something that we need to understand, that the First Amendment is basically just protecting people's freedom of speech from incursion by elements of the government. At the same time, it implies responsibilities that we have as people to speak to each other. And in my experience, I have seen the desire to repress speech coming from across the political spectrum. Predominantly, I have had the experience of those on the left who have had me removed from situations. For example, a KPFK, the Los Angeles Pacifica affiliate broadcaster, Sonali Kolhatkar, had me removed from the question and answer line in talking to a key young woman leader in Afghanistan, because she knew that I was going to bring up something about September 11th and the roles of the United States, and potentially I might have brought up the role of Israel in relationship to that. I brought it up after the event, after I was removed from the question and answer line and not allowed to use my time to ask my question. I had to write it down, but I ultimately did talk to the young Afghani woman and her contingent about the role of Zionist power in September 11th. And at that point, they seemed to understand why I had been singled out for being taken out of line. Okay, that happened multiple times. Another example of the left trying to suppress my speech was Max Blumenthal, who did it multiple times. I was in an event with him, a private event in Beverly Hills where he was presenting his book back in 2009, I think. And I questioned, it was the beginning of the Obama administration, and Max Blumenthal was on a tear about the sort of sadistic background of some of the religious right Republicans, and in terms of relationship to serial murders of women, these types of things. And I was pointed out very directly. I was like, a lot of the people in this room voted for the current commander in chief, who in terms of being a serial woman murderer is way beyond any domestic, serial murder in the United States of America in terms of how many women he's now killed. And then I pointed out September 11th, and we went into that. And then I was asked to leave. I was told to leave that event because they were uncomfortable with me being there. I spoke to the man of the house and asked him whether I could wait till the end of the event. It was maybe about 45 minutes to see if I could speak, person to person, man to man with Max Blumenthal about our disagreements. And he said, sure. And he actually talked to me for a while. Max Blumenthal snuck out the back door and then went on the radio on Pacifica, on KPFK, and skewed all kinds of details, slandered me in many ways, and tried to even paint me as physically a threat to him, as if I were waiting outside to talk to him to try to beat him up or something, rather than to actually have
it's similar to how Alex Jones reacted after the Austin, Texas gun rally, where he called the people who he actually crashed this peaceful rally. He labeled the people who were holding the rally as COINTELPRO and said he had to go in and act like that.
Yes. So those those trying to suppress your speech cry out in pain as they strike you. I don't know. Max Blumenthal continued that, where he had me removed from a bookstore where he was doing an open public book signing and Q&A, and claimed that I was a threat to him, and the West Hollywood sheriffs were called out, and it was pretty clear that I was not a physical threat to him, but maybe my ideas were a threat to his belief system. Of course, there was Bill Maher's show when I interjected when he was on what I saw as some type of incitement, anti-Semitic incitement against Arab men. I reminded him that have you ever seen what Hellfire missiles do to Muslim women? And I pointed out his role in reifying the lies of September 11th, which of course have been used as part of the mass murder of men, women, and children. Then there was major violent force used against me there and getting me out of there when they could have just asked me to leave. I've also, yes, had my speech under assault from more of the right. In certain ways, I've been kept out of events like at the Rand Corporation. That's maybe more somewhere in the neoliberal, neoconservative middle, maybe. I was grabbed by some type of old crusty spook in a suit at the Richard Nixon Library around my neck for calling out so-called General Richard Myers for contradicting his story on September 11th after Bruno Breuweiler had called him out for lying about September 11th. So I've encountered and then of course our experience at the Kansas City Public Library, which was a response across the political board in many ways, with so-called progressive Zionists at the sort of executive helm of the group funding the event, the Dennis Ross event about Truman in Israel, and hiring the off-duty police and the security guys who ultimately used force against us and forced us out of there, and used force against a librarian, and then put in a librarian and me under arrest and under indictment for more than a year. That was rather than just sort of saying, "Sir, we want to move on." No, violence, state violence, and then deception and lies afterwards. So my reason for bringing all of that up is that the instinct to use force or suppression or violence, even including the powers of the state against people whose speech you don't like, is very much present in certain aspects of our American politics. And I would encourage all to move into this opening. And we talked about this Russia Insider article that talked about the dropping of the Jew taboo, and it sort of heralded the alt-right as sort of opening up the conversation in that regard. And we gave our take, and we gave our ups and downs and that type of thing. But in a way, yes, okay, this is an opening that the alt-right has given, I would say. It's an opening for speech. It's an opening for the power of speech, and those on the left of good, moral and intellectual fiber, I would propose have to step into the fold. We are also going to step into the fold. Whether my conception of the aspect of a full spectrum populism or the radical middle, or an integral politics, an integral deep politics, these types of things, we're going to be in the fold too. And I hope that these alt-right characters who are now starting to go to blood war, which I think is a great thing. Let's go to blood war in a war of ideas and a war of words, rather than subject innocent people around the world to the rain of hellfire missiles. Much better, proposal, or sort of going the route of the proposed civil war between the info warheads and the Hollywood so-called elite. I'm not interested in any of those kind of blood sports. I am interested in this blood sports of ideas, and I would urge people to get involved. So let's get this popping in 2018.
Yeah, great points all around the table. And one of the things with, and once again, it's not to say that the right is not involved in stifling free speech. Certainly they are. You'll see groups like you'll see Breitbart, for example. You'll see groups that are directly affiliated with someone like David Horowitz. They'll be the first ones to try and shut down the free speech of someone who's too critical of Israel or Zionism. Poor little, persecuted Israel. But I think the problem is more right now. It seems to be much more pronounced on the left, especially since the rise of Trump and the movement that surrounds him. I mean, whether going back to Milo at Berkeley and all the things that have followed that, it is primarily the left. And my fear is that you've got people on the left who may naturally be inclined to believe in free speech, even for the most controversial of figures. But it seems in a lot of ways that some of these types of people are being, I don't know if they're being conditioned in some ways to tolerate violence or some type of physical threats against various speakers who they detest or whose ideas they find reprehensible. And I think that perhaps they feel that there may be a difference between the state doing it by force, like what happened with you, and perhaps maybe some some mask wearing Antifas. And by the way, Antifa at the very highest levels appears to be very much infiltrated and filled with provocateurs and informants and agents at some level within the federal government and within the intelligence agencies. But perhaps they feel it's different when it's citizens carrying out these things, like the person who punched Richard Spencer, for example. I know a lot of people got enjoyment out of that, but it's very dangerous regardless of whether it's actual government agents in suits or whether it's foot soldiers wearing masks. I mean, either way, and it's detrimental for the reasons that we've stated, and it's detrimental for other reasons as well. And so I think it's important that we start to open up not only a dialogue with the right, but also maybe start to show some of these people on the left that might be inclined to support attempts to stifle events held by people like Richard Spencer or whoever else, that it's important, no matter how much you detest them, no matter how awful human beings they are, to actually listen to them and then counter them intellectually rather than just try to shut them down and create all kinds of chaos to do so.
Yes, and it's pretty clear that in this day and age, when the weapons that we have at our disposal, if you go all the way up the chain of command, are the type of weapons that could destroy the entire planet and make it uninhabitable for living beings of all sorts for many years. And this includes weaponry that we probably don't even know its parameters or existence, whether it's scalar weaponry or these types of things, or the depths of potential chemical or biological warfare. So in some way, we do have a choice here. We have a political choice to make for the rest of this 21st century, when we clearly have major crises that we might disagree about the nature of the crises, whether political, ecological, economic, and we'll definitely disagree about the nature of the causes of the crises. But I think that we can get all people of political good faith at the table by a commitment to free-form political discourse. And this, of course, is where the spooks can be exposed, those not of good faith, those playing a role, those who are lifetime actors, these types of things. Because in many ways, what they are just going to be doing is mimicking old divide and conquer ideas. And in this day and age, it is the case that still one of the most difficult things for people to do is to think. Is to think on their own and to not think from groupthink and group dynamics, or to be given a box to sit in that feels comfortable. And at the same time, not to become just a reactionary with your epistemology or with your politics, where you format yourself in relationship to what you're against. Okay? So 2018, let's get it on. So I guess until next week,
all right.
Antidote out.
Indeed. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Greg.